Okay, hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's wonderful chat. I am so glad you're all here with us this evening and you've chosen to be with us uh, on this wintry, bleak midwinter night. Thank you for warming our souls by coming on board and being with us. I'm Linnell Stevens, and I'm Village Preservation's Director of Development and Special Events. And I will be co-hosting our program tonight with my colleague Hugh Evans and tonight's speaker, the lovely Lucie Levine. We always love to have Lucie around. Thank you for being here, Lucie. I just want to share a little bit about our organization tonight with you. I know a lot of you know who we are. You've come to our programs before. You've been with us for some of you many years, but I want to just, for those of you who are new, I'd like to share who we are and what we do because it's really important. Village Preservation has been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and to stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs per year, just like this one, and most of them are free to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth of our communities and the value of preservation. We are a nonprofit, membership-based organization, so your involvement and your support mean the world to us. You can learn more about us on our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. And my colleague here, Hugh, is going to drop that in the chat right now. So there it is. Just a tiny bit of Zoom protocol. You probably heard this before too, but I'm gonna say it again. I won't be visible during most of the talk because Lucie's going to take over. You're in good hands, but I'll be here. So please feel free to use the chat, say hi, tell us where you're coming from, raise any issues or thoughts that you'd like to raise. And if you have questions for Lucie, our speaker, please use the Q&A function. It just helps us to keep track of the questions, make sure that we're answering as many as we possibly can. And you can do that any point during the talk, and we'll just get to as many of them following the chat with Lucie. And I am so pleased now to introduce to you Lucie Levine. Lucie is a writer and historian and NYC tour guide. She founded the historical company Archive on Parade and has collaborated with several neighborhood institutions on tours, lectures, and events. She's also the public programs consultant at Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts and a contributing history writer at 6 Square Feet. So Lucie, thank you so much for being with us again tonight and for being here, especially to talk about one of my favorite people, artists and people, Berenice Abbott. The incredible photographer and pretty much lifelong villager, or since she was 19, right?
Thank you so much. What a joy to be here. I am always so happy to give talks for Village Preservation, certainly one of my favorite organizations in this city, because Greenwich Village is one of my favorite neighborhoods. And of course, it was also one of Berenice Abbott's favorite neighborhoods. And so this talk will be not only a discussion of her pioneering photography, but also of her lifelong affinity for and relationship with Greenwich Village, its architecture, its artists, and its institutions. Now, the photo that you see here at the very beginning of this slide lecture is, of course, Washington Square Park. This photograph she took in April of 1936, and it was published in her seminal book of photography, Changing New York, which was published by the Federal Arts Project in 1939. And that book, on which she collaborated with her partner, Elizabeth McCausland, had captions for each of the photos that she took. McCausland wrote the captions, and part of the caption that accompanied this photograph speaks not only to Berenice Abbott's lens, the lens through which she was taking those photos, which was literally, as the title tells us, changing New York, and her interest in what she called old New York, and then out of it coming new New York, and this constant juxtaposition of old and new. And the reason that I mention that to you is because village preservation is, as its own name suggests, a preservation organization dealing with the fabric of the city and this question of old and new and sensible development. And so when we think of Elizabeth McCausland's caption of this photograph, it's interesting to note that part of the caption read, "Behind the arch, the old houses of Washington Square North have so far resisted demolition. But the skyscraper apartment at number 1 Fifth Avenue symbolizes the fate the old square may look forward to." So then, as now, the fate of Greenwich Village and what it meant architecturally to watch the city change was something that Berenice Abbott was continually capturing through the lens of her camera. And in many ways, the way that we think of New York, the vision that we have of our city, comes out of the vision that she captured for us. She said that a photographer must see the image. The camera cannot see it for you. And so it was she who saw the city, and through her lens, through her eyes, we see it as well. So who was she? This is Berenice Abbott. You can see she lived a very long life, 1898 to 1991. Now, she was raised in Ohio, the daughter of a single mother. She went for a year to Ohio State University, but left early. She actually followed her OSU friends, James and Susan Light, to Greenwich Village. She arrived in Greenwich Village in February of 1918. It was one of the coldest winters on record. And she lives with Susan Light, James and Susan Light, on McDougal Street. And so what's interesting when we look at her photography as it was published later in her life, we can see not only that it's a record of New York, but in many ways, a record of her own experience. So this is a photograph that she takes of the Provincetown Playhouse, December 29th, 1936. At that time, you can see very prominently number 133. At that time, it was still at 133. McDougal Street, it would move, or it had moved from 139 McDougal Street. And Berenice Abbott was not only photographing Provincetown Playhouse, which was known as the cradle of American drama, right? That had given a launch pad to Eugene O'Neill, that had seen some of the earliest performances by Betty Davis, right? That this had been a space of real change, real artistic change, not only in New York, but in the nation. So Berenice Abbott not only captures this place, but also she was actually deeply a part of this change and of this artistic ferment in Greenwich Village. For example, this is a photograph of Ida Ruh on stage in Susan Glaspell's play, Berenice. Now, Susan Glaspell was married to Jig Cook, who was the original director of the Provincetown Playhouse. And Susan Glaspell would go on actually to win the 1931 Pulitzer Prize for Allison's House. But this particular image is of her play Berenice, and it's actually a joke. It is a reference to Berenice Abbott. The action of this play circles around a titular character by the name of Berenice, who is not present in the play itself. And the joke is that Berenice Abbott herself would actually leave Greenwich Village in 1919. She arrives, as I had mentioned to you, she arrives in February of 1918, and in 1919, she was felled by the 1918 flu, by the Spanish flu, and she had to recuperate upstate. But she was so much a part of this world and so deeply involved in the artistic ferment surrounding the Provincetown Playhouse that even though she wasn't there, there's a whole play that's written about her absence, which is titled Berenice. And the question you may have is, okay, if the people who were also involved in this world included Edna St. Vincent Millay and Eugene O'Neill and Ida Ruh herself, Susan Glaspell herself, this deeply celebrated group of artists, how did Berenice Abbott become so much a part of this world in Greenwich Village that her absence engenders an entire play? You know, that her friends can't stop thinking about her even though she isn't there. Well, how does this happen? She moves when she gets to Greenwich Village in February of 1918. She will move in with James and Susan Light. James Light will later actually himself become the director of the Provincetown Playhouse, but they all move in together at 137 McDougal Street. Now, 137 McDougal Street was home to two very interesting social spaces at this time. Not only is it right next to the Provincetown Playhouse, but also it is literally on top of, so they'll live in their apartment at 137 McDougal Street, literally on top of the Liberal Club. This is a photograph taken by Jessie Tarbox Beals, who was another female photographer living in Greenwich Village at that time. Jessie Tarbox Beals was actually the first published female photojournalist in the United States of America. She took this photograph in 1917. The Liberal Club was billed as a space for people, quote, interested in new ideas. So an avant-garde literary and artistic space. Now, also at 137 McDougal Street, and this is a photo also by Jessie Tarbox Beals, was on the ground floor was Polly Holliday's restaurant. Polly Holliday was an anarchist and a restaurateur. Polly's restaurant here at 137 McDougal Street also played host to Heterodoxy, which was a group for a number of women who described themselves as unorthodox women, women who were interested in being their, quote, whole big human selves, not just, quote, their little female selves. Now, Heterodoxy stands out as an early pioneering group, especially amongst lesbian and queer women, of which Berenice Abbott herself identified as a lesbian. And in fact, she and her partner, Elizabeth McCausland, would live in Greenwich Village for more than 30 years. Now, the reason that I mention this to you is because this is the space, this is the building into which Berenice Abbott moves when she arrives in Greenwich Village. So she moves into a building that is already home to the Liberal Club and to Heterodoxy. So when she gets to Greenwich Village, she describes it as the center of everything. And indeed, it was, because here were the avant-garde currents of American life flowing through Greenwich Village. So whether it be modern art, whether it be modernist philosophy, whether it be issues surrounding free love, whether it be freedom of dress, freedom from convention around heteronormativity, things like that, Berenice Abbott finds a place. Now, where does she go her first night in New York? She goes to the Hell Hole, also known as the Golden Swan, West 4th Street and 6th Avenue. This is a painting by Charles Demuth, made in 1919. The artist is front and center in the foreground here with his back to the canvas, and to his right, the figure to his right is supposed to be Marcel Duchamp. Now, who should Berenice Abbott meet on her first night at New York, at the Golden Swan, at the Hellhole? Well, none other than Eugene O'Neill, Edna St. Vincent Millay, and Holger Cahill. Now, Holger Cahill is an interesting figure in this moment, that Berenice Abbott would meet him and that he would become a confidant and a lifelong friend, and that she would meet him really at the genesis of her life in New York, because Holger Cahill later would become the director of the Federal Arts Project. Federal One was the division of the WPA, of which the Federal Writers Project was a part, of which the Federal Theater Project was a part, and it would be Holger Cahill and the Federal Arts Project that would ultimately publish her seminal work, which was Changing New York. She would join the Federal Arts Project in 1935. But before she does that, literally decades before she begins what will become her most celebrated work, she's already surrounded by the artists and the personalities who will make that work possible. Not only her own genius, which of course it was, but immediately upon moving to New York, she meets Holger Cahill, who will later be so important to that work. Okay. There are other figures whom she meets early on in Greenwich Village. This is Baroness Elsa von Frege Loringhoven. Now, she's known as the mother of Dada, and the Baroness will actually live with Berenice Abbott for a time at her apartment on West 10th Street. And it will be while she's living on West 10th Street in 1920 that she will meet, speaking of Dada, these two people, Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp. Now, this is a photograph of Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp playing chess in 1955. But Marcel Duchamp was obsessed with chess and had been for many years before this photograph was taken. In fact, Berenice Abbott will meet Man Ray in 1920, and through him, Marcel Duchamp. And Marcel Duchamp will enlist Berenice Abbott in one of her earliest artistic projects in Greenwich Village. Because before she was a photographer, Berenice Abbott actually had an ambition to be a sculptor. She came to Greenwich Village wanting not to be a photographer, but actually to be a sculptor. And so Marcel Duchamp says to her, "Please help me. I have designed a chess set. I would like for you to help me sculpt my own chess pieces. I am then going to use this chess set to play with my dear friend Man Ray," which they did for many, many years, and you can see them doing it right here. But Berenice Abbott's relationship with Man Ray, which was a friendship relationship and also a professional relationship, in many ways changes her artistic trajectory. So Berenice Abbott, I had mentioned to you, was the daughter of a single mother. So when she came to Greenwich Village, she did not come from a place of middle-class comfort in a way that so many other of the sort of bohemian artist figures in Greenwich Village did at that time. She was not getting a stipend from home, as many of her contemporaries in Greenwich Village were at that moment. She always needed to work. And one of the jobs that she took was as a model, as an artist's model. And you can see her actually working here. So she becomes very close friends with Man Ray, but this is not only a friendship relationship, this is a professional relationship. She is posing for him because she needs the money, and she would always work to support herself. That was always, and indeed, that becomes part of why she joins the Federal Art Project. Yes, she wants to make pictures, but she needs the pay. So here we have her entrance into this Dada surrealist world. We can see another way in which she posed for Man Ray. This is Man Ray's coat stand of the same year, 1920. There is no way looking at this photograph to know that Berenice Abbott is posing for this collage, but indeed that is her. So her face is eclipsed behind the image of the woman's face, but that is her body. And so she rounds out Man Ray's coat stand here. Now, she, in 1921, will go to Paris, and Man Ray will also go to Paris, and she will, again needing work, be his darkroom assistant in Paris. And he says to her, you can develop my photographs, and then in your time off, you can develop your photographs. And so Berenice Abbott goes to Paris and will become the most sought after portrait photographer in the city of Paris in the 1920s. And many people declared her to be the finest portrait photographer in the world at that time. This is her portrait of Jean Cocteau. Jean Cocteau described Berenice Abbott as a chess game between dark and light. And her interest in what were later termed her Paris portraits was to create or to achieve with her subjects a type of intimacy that one did not usually gain to these celebrated figures, because almost all of the people whom she will photograph in Paris are the most celebrated writers and artists of their time. This is James Joyce. This is a photograph she took in 1926. She would also photograph him with the hat and the cane, which would become the author photo for Ulysses. And so when we think of James Joyce, often we think of photos taken by Berenice Abbott. This one to me is so interesting because this is not the photo that we think of when we think of James Joyce. And I think it is a much more intimate, much less posed look at Joyce than perhaps we're used to seeing, that she was able to convey within her subjects a kind of psychological interiority that perhaps other photographers did not find. She also, while in Paris, photographed a swath of the city's expatriate, not only writers and artists, but also the expatriate lesbian community living in Paris at that time that was centered around the Shakespeare and Company bookshop owned by Sylvia Beach. Now, it was Sylvia Beach's influence that brought Berenice Abbott to subjects such as Jean Cocteau, such as James Joyce, because Sylvia Beach published Joyce, right? It was she who was at the center of this expatriate community. But when we look at Abbott's photograph of Sylvia Beach, we can see something that she also was trying to achieve, which is that Berenice Abbott wanted to find within her female subjects the same psychological interiority, the same humanness, the same wholeness that she tried to find within her male subject. She believed that male photographers often photographed women as if they were objects and photographed them only to be beautiful. And her goal was much broader than that. It was to find a deeper humanness, right? Our whole big human selves, as they said in Greenwich Village, as they said at Heterodoxy, downstairs from Berenice Abbott's apartment, right? And so we can see the kind of sort of political foundation that Berenice Abbott gets at in her early years in Greenwich Village that will inform the way that she moves through the world. So here we have her photograph of Sylvia Beach. We also have, this is a photograph of Janet Flanner. Janet Flanner was also part of this international expatriate lesbian community. She was one half of the lesbian couple that published the Little Review in Greenwich Village. So what's interesting about this photograph is the subtext here. We have Flanner looking at the camera and looking at us straight on without a mask, but we see the masks on her hat and this question of how many lives is she living? Is she living an unmasked life or a masked life? Is she able to live as her true self in Paris or not? So is she living as her whole big human self as an out lesbian or not in Paris? And that question is something that Berenice Abbott is able to ask in quite an interesting way in this portrait. Now, Berenice Abbott's time in Paris also brought her into contact with another photographer by the name of Eugene Atget. This is her photograph of Atget, which she took in 1927. Now, she became a steward for Atget's work. Atget was a Parisian street photographer, and Berenice Abbott was influenced by and also became a champion of his entire oeuvre. So, for example, this is a photograph which he took in 1923, which Abbott herself printed. Now, before she returned to New York in 1928, Atget actually would die. And so when Atget dies, Berenice Abbott takes with her back to New York all of his negatives and assigns to herself, in a sense, the role of making him known throughout the world. Now, she sees his photography, and there is a relationship between his photos of Paris and the photos that she would later create. So, for example, we can see his work in 1923, and we can see her work in 1935, right? And we can go back and forth. 1923, Paris, 1935, New York. But what's interesting here is that Berenice Abbott saw also a real difference between her work and Atget's work, which was that she believed that when Atget was photographing Paris, he was photographing something that was already art, that the city of Paris was already a work of art, that it was actually not a city in flux, right? That the Beaux-Arts, the Second Empire style, the ideal of Baron Haussmann was something that was essentially immutable, that it was not changing in the way that New York was changing. And so what Eugene Atget was simply photographing the beauty that Paris already was. And what Berenice Abbott believed that she was doing was she was photographing a city in flux, okay? And so she was making art out of the change that she saw, the old and the new. She said of photography, she said her subject was old New York and coming out of it, new New York. What I liked very much was this transition and this feeling of the emergence of the city, the contrast. This is New York. New York is not a finished city. It is a city in process, changing every day. And because it was changing every day, she said, the challenge of photography is seeing the now. And this is the hardest thing of all to see. What has meaning now? So the exact moment of it is something that really lends itself to photography as a medium, right? That when Berenice Abbott creates an image, when she takes a photograph, she's immortalizing only one moment. And before and after that moment, the city could and did look entirely different. And so she's capturing New York literally in a moment of change, changing New York. But her point is that New York is always changing, that there is no kind of ossification as one could find in Paris. And so if one were to take the same survey of photographs, which contemporary photographers actually have done. There have been people who've gone back to each of the spaces that Berenice Abbott took photos in New York and followed her footsteps in changing New York. And there's one very famous one, which is a survey called New York Changing, which is the reference to changing New York, saying, okay, what if we were to take these photographs in our own time, and we would see a totally different city. And that's the point that she makes, which is that as she's moving through the city, her question is, what has meaning now? And why does she do this? Well, she comes back to New York in January of 1929. And in that moment, when she arrives again in New York, she doesn't immediately move back down to Greenwich Village. She will shortly thereafter, but not yet. When she arrives in 1929, she'll actually move to Hotel des Artistes on 67th Street, where she will take a studio, and she will continue to make portraits as she had done in Paris. But there's the crash, right? And even after the crash, she refuses to charge less than $150 per portrait. And so while living at Hotel des Artistes, she photographed tycoons for Fortune magazine throughout the Depression. And money, as I said, she was always working, which is why she needed to be Man Ray's model. Money was always very important to her. And so she refused, for example, to photograph Hart Crane because he wouldn't pay her, and she would not do anything gratis. Now, when she gets back to New York, she had been debating between New York and Cleveland because she was from Ohio. And she says that when she arrived in New York in 1929, she said, when I saw New York again and stood in the dirty slush, I felt that here was the thing I was wanting to do all my life. She was moved by the neglect of American material by American artists. And she said it was time for America to be interpreted honestly, that the nation needed to be approached with love devoid of sentimentality, and not solely with criticism and irony. So we see her approaching New York just that way, with love devoid of sentimentality and not solely with criticism and irony. Now, when she begins to photograph New York, and I am going to focus mostly on the photos that she took of Greenwich Village, but I do want to show you a number of photos that she took around the city just to understand, so that we can discuss her photography style, and so we can understand what actually she was doing. So again, that her goal is old New York and coming out of it, new New York. So the juxtaposition of old and new, of a city in flux, is something that we're going to see from Berenice Abbott again and again and again. So in this particular moment here, West Street between Warren and Murray Streets in 1936, we see 19th century row houses. And then behind them, we see rising above it, the Woolworth building, right? And what's so interesting to me in this photograph in 1936, what are we really looking at? Because is the Woolworth building new New York? Not in this moment, not in 1936, right? The Woolworth building had been the tallest building in the world from 1913 when it opened until 1930 when it was eclipsed by the Chrysler building. And then of course the Chrysler building was eclipsed in 1931 by the Empire State Building. So we have this question of what is flux? What is old New York and new New York? What does it mean to capture the now? What has meaning now? Here we have, I think, a really interesting way that she communicates old and new. Once again, we have the 19th century structures and rising behind them the 20th century structures, right? We have our skyscrapers, but also think about the juxtaposition of old and new in a number of ways here. If we see on the left the Model T, the black car, and on the right, we see the white milk truck, right? So the juxtaposition there of color, which is black and white. And then also we have, in the black car, we have horsepower. And on the white milk truck, we literally have a horse, right? So it's the question of the motorized horsepower of the automobile and the physical horsepower of the traditional milk truck. So old and new in that regard as well. Signified not only in technological change, but also in color palette as well. So we can see not only in the heights of the buildings, but in the technology surrounding those buildings, changing New York. Now, what's interesting about this is that this ongoing project captured so much flux, and indeed, in certain ways, too much flux. During this project, Berenice Abbott said that she believed that New York was changing too rapidly. She would go to take a photo, and 2 weeks later, the image that she hoped to capture would be gone. And you can see that here, right? This is Old Law Tenements 1937. What you're seeing are actually back tenements, okay? And in front of them, another row of tenements had actually been demolished. So what she had been intending to capture, by the time she was able to capture it, it was no longer there. Now, how did this happen? This sense of 2 weeks later, it was gone. Well, why did she need 2 weeks? How did this process take place? Well, what she would do is she'd go out every Wednesday with a small camera and create contact prints of city views. She thought of them as just snapshots, notes, photographic notes, which she grouped by location, topic, or interpretation. And so you can see that here. Here are other sketches that she took, photographic sketches. And why, you might ask, did she go out every Wednesday? Well, once again, she's a working artist, and so she couldn't devote every day to this project before she joins the Federal Art Project in 1935. So prior to 1935, she can only go out every Wednesday, which she does. And when she goes out and makes these photographic sketches, she'll take notes about what time of day she wants to return to photograph, what light she's looking for, just essentially what the right moment is, what the right mood is. So for example, this is the Stock Exchange. It's a photograph taken in 1933, but she knew that the light as it was hitting the Stock Exchange would only hit in this way straight on against the columns in the middle, as you see it, against the pediment like that, for 1 hour. She also knew that she wanted to take this photograph when, yes, there were people on the street, but that the street was not thronged with people, that it was not clogged with people. So she came back on a weekend. She also knew that if she came on a Sunday, on which this photo was taken, the flag would not be flying, but she wanted to capture the American flag. And so she actually approached the Stock Exchange and asked them to fly the flag for her when she took this photo, which they did. So this is interesting because here's a photo that she's taking of New York in flux, but it is actually a staged photograph. Now, this is not taken for Changing New York, because again, Changing New York, she will not begin until she joins the Federal Arts Project in 1935. But this notion of her subject, of a changing city, well, what's so interesting from a contemporary point of view is look where she is. She's standing on the steps of Federal Hall behind the George Washington statue, right? She's looking directly at the Stock Exchange. To the left is the House of Morgan. I mean, this is an image that is not so different from exactly what you would see if you were standing on the steps of Federal Hall right now, that all of these structures still stand, which is quite interesting. Although when this was taken in 1933, it was not clear that Federal Hall would be saved. Indeed, Federal Hall was saved due to its involvement in the 1939 World's Fair, that it was saved because the site of Federal Hall coincided with the marketing of the fair, which was the 150th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration, which took place while not in that physical building because it had been a sub-treasury building, on that site. So the original Federal Hall is on the site of today's Federal Hall. But because the 1939 World's Fair was able to traffic on that history, the building was saved. And interestingly enough, Berenice Abbott herself was able to, quote unquote, benefit in the same way from the 1939 World's Fair, which is to say that her volume, Changing New York, was published to coincide with the opening of the fair and was actually sold in New York at the 1939 World's Fair, right? The World of Tomorrow. So here she has Changing New York, published to show the city. She became the official photographer of New York to show what the city was and what it meant to the world of tomorrow. So the same event which saved Federal Hall, interestingly, and sort of made this not a changing tableau, also, in a way, made possible her largest project, which would be Changing New York. Okay. There's something that I want you to understand too about the work that she was doing. I had mentioned to you that she goes out and she takes these small contact prints, right? But when she goes back, she's taking a very large camera with her. This was, she became very famous for the large format camera, and you can see indeed how large that was. And here she is on the job. Now, look how heavy that camera is. From the introduction of Changing New York, 1939, Audrey McMahon writes, "Her photographs are not dressed up with trailing clouds, nor dramatized with superficial tricks or angle shots, soft lighting or oversimplification. This is straight photography. Amid traffic, haste, vibration, crowds, confusion, she has set up her 8x10 camera, leveled it off with a tiny carpenter's spirit level, composed the image on ground glass, focused it, calculated exposure, and taken the picture. But the layman must not think for an instant that these photographs were made by merely pressing a button. They are the work of a master artist who is a master craftsman as well. Indeed, that she is a master artist, that everything she is doing is entirely deliberate, that there is no way that any of the images that she's giving us are accidental, because she needs to do all the things that I just read, which is to focus the camera, to compose the image, to calculate the exposure, to take the picture. This is not a point and shoot situation, that this takes a great deal of premeditation and a great deal of planning. So she begins, and also not only is she taking all this premeditation and all of this planning, but also she's giving us views of the city that we're not likely to see, because she takes that very heavy 8x10 camera and she brings it up to the roof of any one of these skyscrapers, right? Changing New York. We're at a moment here where the city is expanding, is exploding into the sky. And she brings us off of the street. We know our city from the street. New York is a walking street. That's how we get anywhere. But she brings us our city from a bird's eye, and not just a bird's eye, but an Abbott eye, right? That we're seeing the city now through her eyes. And also her biographer, Julia Van Haften, calls a lot of her perspective the modernist's formal interest in off-balance perspective. And so again, the early training that she gets in Greenwich Village and the relationship that she has to the modern artists living and working there, in particular, the surrealists and the Dada artists with whom she became very close, you can see that modernist aesthetic later in her work, which you see here. Okay. Now, she would begin at the waterfront and move northward. I particularly love this image at Pier 11, 1936, because we see the mast of a 19th century sailing ship, and we see that mast echoed then in the upward thrust, the upward trajectory of the skyline and the skyscrapers. And indeed, this question of changing New York, well, where is this ship pointed? Where can this ship possibly go? Except for into the city, right? Into the world of tomorrow, right? Into the skyscraper future of New York. So from the 19th century working waterfront into the 20th century skyline, that one becomes the other here, which I think is quite beautiful. Okay, and not only that, she's also making compositional art. Look at the way she frames these skyscrapers from the Brooklyn Bridge in May of 1936. Right here, we can see the city services building. We can see 120 Wall Street framed by the Brooklyn Bridge and the tobacco inspection warehouse. And what's interesting to me, not only is that she gives us this frame that we can see New York rising out of old New York, but also from a contemporary perspective, right? The Brooklyn Bridge still stands. The tobacco inspection warehouse does too. For example, most of the East River shore under Brooklyn Heights, what we now call Dumbo along the waterfront, was after the Civil War built up with these types of warehouses. It was called Brooklyn's Walled City, but only two of them really stand today, one of which is this, is the tobacco inspection warehouse. Today, it's St. Anne's warehouse, right? And so it is something that from our own perspective, this image, while the city has certainly changed, what she's giving us is something that we can also recognize. But I want you, in terms of the compositional art that she created, I want you to understand that she's giving us literally a frame, a picture within a picture, which I think is so beautiful. And again, this question of modernist perspective and Dada, she's giving us a foreshortening here, almost a collage. We have the old post office and then we have the Woolworth building. But with the foreshortening of perspective, it looks as if one is almost pasted on top of the other. And again, this question of, is the Woolworth building New New York? Are we looking at old New York and New New York? Or are we indeed looking at two structures that have already seen the change? We know from our own perspective today that the old post office no longer stands, but the Woolworth building still does. And so what does, in this moment, what does changing New York mean when we look at this image? This is Exchange Place, 1933. And again, in terms of compositional art and the way that she's framing, I did not crop this. This is actually the image that she gives us, is the tightness here. And anybody who has walked on Exchange Place, you may realize Exchange Place is not part of the grid as we understand it, right? That it's almost a leftover from New Amsterdam, right? That it is this intensely tight space, like a lane. And Berenice Abbott shows us that, but she shows us that old lane, that old vestige of New Amsterdam, but in the way that it has been built up like a canyon from New York, right? The rising of the skyscrapers in Lower Manhattan. But what's interesting to me is, while I, as a New Yorker, I'm very familiar with walking Exchange Place, this is not a vantage point with which I am familiar. And I don't think perhaps many of us are, right? That I don't know actually what her vantage point is, where she's looking from, which is quite interesting to me, that she has us suspended in space. And so we have the tightness, right? We have the claustrophobia that we understand exchange place to engender, but also an experience of suspension that I think is not usual in our own experience of that space. And so she's giving us both the familiar and the unusual, which I think is, again, a reference to the Dada and Surrealist world out of which she came. Okay. We also have, again, this question of old New York, new New York. We see the bridge, we see the working harbor, and yet we see the skyscrapers rising even out of the frame. That this question of newness and what it means for the world of tomorrow, changing New York, that it's changing even beyond what we can see, right? That these buildings, that this city grows and is in flux even beyond our own view in this image. Here she gives us city arabesque, again, making art out of the city itself, as opposed to what she had said of Atget's work in Paris, is photographing the beauty that's already there. She's making beauty out of sort of the modern industrial aesthetic of New York. Okay, now, interestingly enough, she's not only photographing New York as an architectural space, right? She's photographing it also as a lived environment. And to do that was pioneering as at all. I mean, pioneering full stop at that time, but pioneering in particular as a woman. Now, she caused a stir for wearing pants. And the reason that I show you this particular image, Blossom Restaurant, 103 Bowery, she was told nice girls don't go to the Bowery. And she said, I'm not a nice girl. I'm a photographer. I go anywhere. And not only was she a photographer, she became the official photographer of New York. And what does that mean? Well, she's showing us not only an architectural space, but a lived environment, a lived experience of New York. And that lived experience of New York, in many ways, was her lived experience because she shows us her city. So here we have her experience of Greenwich Village. Here she is on Bleecker Street. Again, on Bleecker Street, and we're really seeing what was then a largely Italian neighborhood in the South Village. This is the 9th Avenue L, speaking of changing New York. I like the 9th Avenue L as an image of changing New York, in which this image was included, because the 9th Avenue L was actually the first elevated train to open in New York City. It opened as early as 1869. Not this particular station, but the 9th Avenue line in general. And so this idea of the world of tomorrow. Well, in a way, we have past, present, and future in this image, right? We have the sort of original elevated line. We have the way that it looked in 1939, and then we have our own understanding of what became of the L, right, in the future, right, in this question of the world of tomorrow, again, capturing the very moment that this was reality, and of course it no longer is, and that's New York. Here we have Passion Place, that's Jefferson Market Courthouse in the background, and so in so many ways, her village is our village, but not our village at all. Now, here we have Gay Street, numbers 14 and 16. This is an interesting image because she notes, or Elizabeth McCausland, who wrote the caption, notes that Gay Street has the distinction in the 1930s at this moment of being the only majority Black street left in Greenwich Village. And Greenwich Village had once been home to one of the largest Black communities in New York. And so Berenice Abbott did not shy away from capturing Black life in New York. She photographed Black life in Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, throughout the city. And she wanted to create, or she wanted to help create a volume of what she hoped would showcase what she then at that time called Negro genius. And what she wanted to do was to help support a volume that would capture not only Black life, but the extraordinary Black achievement in New York and elsewhere as well. And so what's interesting, again, is the relationship that Berenice Abbott has to not only Greenwich Village as an artistic center, but also as a political center, that her relationship to a growing understanding of civil rights, a growing understanding of gay rights, things like that, is telegraphed through her photographs, probably more so than was understood when they were published. So for example, this is a very political image. This is Gunsmith and Police Department, Center Street, 1937. Now, here we have the gun pointed at the police department, okay? And this question of what does it mean? Or how does the police function, right? And how is quote unquote public safety metered out in New York? Well, looking at this, you can say down the barrel of a gun. And that this was meant as a political act, as a political photograph. Now it's interesting because the Museum of the City of New York became the institutional sponsor for Changing New York, and so purchased her negatives for the project for a whopping $106.37. But also it has not only her negatives, but also the original captions that were supposed to accompany the images, which Elizabeth McCausland wrote. And so this is in the archives of the Museum of the City of New York, and it is the original caption for the Gunsmith photo. And Elizabeth McCausland writes, "Content is inseparable from form here," right? And so she's making the veiled reference to the fact that this is Berenice Abbott's political opinion about the police department, right? And the relationship between power and public safety in New York, and the role of the NYPD in New York and what it is, which is, a gun-toting institution, right? And so what's interesting to understand is that Berenice Abbott and Elizabeth McCausland will live together in Greenwich Village from 1936 to 1966. They will live in the village for 30 years. And Berenice Abbott will have, and also Elizabeth McCausland, both of them will be followed by the FBI, not only because they are living together as lesbians, but also because they were considered to be dangers to society. They were considered to be alleged communists, right? And so Berenice Abbott's political life, which was informed early on by the IWW, later by the burgeoning civil rights movement, was considered to be a quote unquote subversive, in 1950s terminology, to be subversive, right? That she actually will sign a major ad that ran in the New York Times in the late 40s and early 50s that stood up against HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, that she became an outspoken opponent of Senator McCarthy, that this was part of her life, that not only was her her work indicative of what she saw in the city, but what she felt about what she saw, that she's giving you not only form, but also content here, and that the two are inseparable. And so we have the original, what Elizabeth McCausland wanted to say about this, about form and content. And then we have what actually ran, which was actually published by the Federal Arts Project. Now it's interesting because the Federal Arts Project was considered by many people on the right, essentially to be a communist front, that there were many people who believed that Federal One, which was the entirety of the Federal Arts Project, which included the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Theater Project, believed that people who were employed by Federal One, like essentially were all communists. But it's interesting because this was still a government publication. This was published, as I had mentioned to you, for the 1939 World's Fair, that this was supposed to be a celebration of New York for the public. And so when it's published, it's not published with this form equals content. It's not published with this political subtext. It's published with this. Frank Lava's gun shop was founded in 1850 by Eli Parker, right? You know, it's entirely factual. It's a very, very different caption than Elizabeth McCausland actually wrote. But speaking of Berenice Abbott and politics, now this is an interesting situation. This is her photo montage, which was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932. She was included that year in MoMA's show, Murals by American Painters and Photographers. Now, what we see in this montage is the modernist manipulation of the image, which harkens back once again to her Dada and Surrealist days. But the political subtext here is interesting because Philip Johnson was at MoMA and was an early supporter of her work. Now, recently, Philip Johnson's name has been removed from the architecture division at the Museum of Modern Art because Philip Johnson was a Nazi sympathizer. But I want you to understand that Berenice Abbott fell out with Philip Johnson in the 1930s. Berenice Abbott canceled Philip Johnson in the early 30s because she knew he was a Nazi sympathizer and was having absolutely none of that. That her politics informed much of her life and much of her work. Now, I'm showing you an image from MoMA, and indeed, even though she fell out with Philip Johnson, she would actually exhibit more work at MoMA than any other photographer in the decades that followed. But as I had mentioned to you, MCNY really becomes her artistic home in New York. The Museum of the City of New York wrote to her, the director of MCNY, Harding Scholl, wrote to her, in regards to your idea of photographing New York City from the point of view of preserving a record of its ever-changing physical as well as sociological aspect, it seems to me that it would be most important a contribution. We have always wanted such a record in this museum, but have not been able to raise the necessary funds. Now, the Museum of the City of New York actually didn't have to raise the funds. Of course, the Federal Arts Project did that and paid Berenice Abbott $145 a month, beginning in 1935. Now, there would be no Changing New York, of course, had Berenice Abbott not met Elizabeth McCausland in the lobby of MCNY in 1934. Yes, indeed. Is there any other like greater New York space to meet the love of your life and lifelong partner than the Museum of the City of New York? I don't think so. Now, why did they meet in the lobby of MCNY? Well, MCNY held a major exhibition of Berenice Abbott's work in 1934 that was so popular that it was held over until 1935. And Elizabeth McCausland was a working art critic, and so she had gone to see the exhibit in 1934. The two meet and will move in together in 1936 to 50 Commerce Street, where they will live for 30 years. And it will be Elizabeth McCausland who will actually write the prospectus for Changing New York. It will be she who will apply to the Federal Arts Project for the project survey that the two of them eventually undertake. Now, Berenice Abbott joins the Federal Arts Project as a supervisor right after Labor Day in 1935, and her project lasts 4 years. It will include over 300 images. And she described her photographs as documentary as well as artistic. Now, let's look at this space, because 50 Commerce Street was not only the home which Abbott shared with McCausland, but also a space of her dark room. What I mean by that is that Abbott took photographs throughout the city, and that many of them she developed at project headquarters, but many of them she also developed literally here in Greenwich Village at 50 Commerce Street. So the role that Berenice Abbott plays in the history of photography takes place not only in Midtown at project headquarters, but literally in Greenwich Village itself. So not only is she photographing the village as part of this project, but also she's literally developing her photographs here. Now, she was never a salaried worker prior to becoming part of the Federal Arts Project, and so she could not have been considered to be on relief on the dole insofar as she was not a salaried worker. And so because she was not considered a relief worker, she was not inhibited from continuing to take other work while she was working for the WPA. So had she been a salaried worker who was out of work and then thereby hired by the WPA, she would not have been allowed to undertake other work. But because she had never been salaried, she was not prohibited from taking on other work. And so beginning in 1934, she began teaching at the New School. And the New School allowed her to teach. So she taught from 1934 to 1958 at the New School. And she offered at the New School one of the earliest college level courses on photography in the nation. And so you can see her teaching here. And what's interesting is that when she began in 1934, she was in her sort of like teacher bio, there were many references to Man Ray, right, and to her being his assistant and to that relationship. But by 1935, she had become so well respected in New York and so well known, right, that she has this major exhibition at MCNY that she becomes so famous that by 1935, the reference to Man Ray is dropped, which I think is quite interesting. Now, in 1937, the Museum of the City of New York will also exhibit 100 of her Changing New York photos. And the 1937 show also coincided with the centennial of the invention of photography as a medium. And so when MCNY thought to itself, okay, how do we articulate what it means to make a photograph? When we think about literally the history of the medium, whose work do we want to showcase? Well, they chose Berenice Abbott because her work was so indicative of the power of the form. So indeed, she becomes synonymous not only as with the city of New York as the official photographer of New York, but literally with the medium of photography itself. Indeed, she was featured in Life magazine in 1938, and she became so associated with the city and with photography in general that, again, she is really the voice of the 1939 World's Fair. That this question of what is New York? Well, it was Berenice Abbott's New York. Now, her role in New York and indeed in the village extends well beyond this project. For example, she not only taught at the New School, but also at the Photo League. And so the Photo League would hold most of its social functions at Cafe Society in Greenwich Village. Cafe Society also being watched, just like Berenice Abbott, by the FBI, because Cafe Society was well known for having integrated performing rosters and also integrated audiences. That this was one of the first spaces in New York City in which Black performers could showcase their talent, right? And so here's an image of Billie Holiday at Cafe Greenwich Village today. And yet again, that this was a lifelong relationship with her, between herself and the village. And so this is published in 1949. And what's interesting, her photographs of the village in 1949 are even more, in a way, personal and less architectural than her Changing New York photographs had been. So if we look at this, we can see here we have 8th Street, 1945, right? And instead of the almost aerial views that she gave us in Changing New York, we have a much tighter, more intimate woman on the street view of the city and of the village than perhaps we had before. This is Edward Hopper in his studio. This was taken between 1945 and 1948. I appreciate this image because she's not only giving us a then contemporary view of Hopper, of his studio, of the village, but also she's giving us a legacy, right? That she herself is an artist in Greenwich Village, and she's giving us the legacy of other artists in Greenwich Village. And indeed, once again, this relationship that she has, the very, very human relationship that she has to the village, that this is her neighborhood, you can really see this coming through in Greenwich Village today and yesterday, that there is a very person-to-person kind of photography. Indeed, speaking of Greenwich Village photography, I opened this webinar with the images of that Jessie Tarbox Beals had taken of the Liberal Club, of heterodoxy, and there's, to my eye, a whiff of that in this, right? That the kind of very close interiority of these cafes and bars in the village, of artist studios, give us that same type of intimacy, which I think is quite interesting. And again, showing us that artistic and photographic legacy in the village, from one woman to another, who I think carries the form forward, which I think is quite interesting. Okay, and then speaking of the village and carrying the message, right? Is there anything more indicative of the village than the Village Voice? Perhaps not. Now, when the Village Voice launched in 1955, Berenice Abbott arranged for the Voice to keep a file of her prints on hand, and they would pay whenever they used a photograph, whenever they published one. And why would they do that? Well, if you needed an image of New York, you needed a Berenice Abbott. Thank you so much. That's what I've got for you. I know we're a little over time. Thank you for sticking with me. I'm going to hop into the questions tab. I'll stop sharing my screen so we can all talk. I'll hop into the questions tab and see if there's anything I can answer. Thank you all so much. It has been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure's all ours, Lucie. Really, thank you so much. I mean, my goodness, you've been, your talk tonight has given us a perspective on Berenice Abbott, but the village and the city and the arts in general and the WPA. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I think our viewers are fascinated with what you've said and presented. So we've got a lot of people asking questions. Hugh, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that people were asking throughout the lecture was about Berenice Abbott's connection to the Dadaists. Did she identify with the Dada movement, or was there another stylistic movement that she preferred to label her work?
Sure. So her early experience with photography is as an assistant to Man Ray and is as a close collaborator with Marcel Duchamp, both of whom were leading lights of the Dada movement. Also, as I had mentioned to you, the Baroness with whom she lives in Greenwich Village was known as the mother of New York Dada. So when she comes up in Greenwich Village as an artist, she comes up through the Dada movement, although she herself, when she's photographing New York, if we were to think about the way that her photography falls, I guess, in the category of artistic movements, hers would be almost more in the like social realist, John Sloan Ashcan school, that kind of sort of unsentimental look at New York. And so the way that Dada really finds its way into her work is more so the off-balance perspective that I had discussed a little bit, that when we see her showing us these bird's eye views of New York and they're off kilter, that's what, or we get this something like Exchange Place and it's really, really tight and it's really claustrophobic. That's where we're finding the Dada. But in terms of her modernist training, it's a Dada training, absolutely.
That's fascinating. Let me see, what other questions do we have in the chat? Let's see. So one of the things that we wanted to know, I think we answered a little bit of this though, is whether she kept diaries so that we know who met and when. And do you know if there was like a process towards discovering these diaries or interpreting them at all?
They're less so diaries. I know there are so many other figures in the village who thankfully did keep diaries, less so with her diaries than letters. She was a prolific letter writer, and so you can see letters between herself and Joanna Barnes, letters between herself and Edna St. Vincent Millay, letters between herself and Marcel Duchamp, for example. And so when we think about her life, she also was interviewed a great deal, and so there's oral histories with her, and there are also recordings of lectures and talks that she gave, for example, at ICP, the International Center for Photography, in the 1970s. She was also interviewed extensively before she died, so in the 1980s. There were many, and also she was, again, I think it's hard to overestimate at this time how famous she was surrounding changing New York. That again, there were profiles that were published of her in Life magazine, not only her work, but literally biographical profiles of her as a person, just because she was so groundbreaking and really so sort of beloved as an artist in America.
Mm-hmm. So contemporaneously, she was very much in the public eye during her time.
Yes.
Yeah. I did put some. I put the New York Public Library link to her letters in the chat. So if anybody wants to see that, it's there. We can put it also in the Q&A. I guess.
Yes, there's also a pretty recent biography of her called Berenice Abbott, A Life, that was published in 2018, which is great. You can also find, if you want to find the physical book, Changing New York, it certainly exists. It was also republished in the 1970s as New York in the 30s. So you can find that at the New York Public Library, at the Brooklyn Public Library. There's certainly no shortage of information. There are also photographs that there are books rather that juxtapose her work and Eugene Atget's. So you can see those too, which is great. Yeah.
Also, she published a book about Greenwich Village. And we should put that in the chat too, Hugh.
We'll have
I'm
to find
looking
that.
for it right now.
Yes, so Greenwich Village Today and Yesterday,
Yes, yes.
which came out in 1949, right? So at the end of this talk, I showed some images from that. So that is less famous today than her Changing New York, which is her magnum opus, but certainly Greenwich Village Today and Yesterday.
It's also harder to find. So yeah, it's out there, but it's harder to find.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have a couple questions from the audience. So a couple of them want to know, did she eventually abandon the large format camera, or were there any other sort of photographic mediums that she used?
Yeah, she invented a number of her own types of photographic plates, which is interesting. So yes, so she became very famous for the large format camera, but then moved on from that. She created what she called an Abbott distorter. And so in the late 40s and early 50s, again, going back to this question of was she actually a Dadaist, she used something called the Abbott distorter, which she sold, she patented and sold. And so she made these sort of distorted images of her own face, and she sold them, and you could make them out of your own self if you wanted to. But she had a number of inventions that was this question of what then was the medium of photography, and what could one do with it, that she was always experimenting.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And let's see, we have another question who is asking how she came to live on Commerce Street.
That's as opposed to like any other street in the village. Well, she had a lifelong relationship with Greenwich Village, and so would always have lived there anyway. But what she was able to, she and Elizabeth McCausland were actually able in that building, which they lived in on Commerce Street, to rent two separate one-room studios right next to each other. And so because they were living as a lesbian couple at that time, what they did was each was the tenant of record in her own studio, but they lived as if it were one apartment. So one studio they used essentially as like a living room, and the other studio they used as a bedroom. And then Berenice also had her own studio space where she would create a dark room and so on. And then when they had parties, which they did pretty frequently, they would open up both studios and they would have people like spilling out into the hallway. And so that question of why she chose 50 Commerce Street, I think it was because they were able in that building to find that configuration, which they wanted. Although that was such a sort of like old school village apartment, because they lived there for 30 years and they didn't have a shower there. Like it literally, they did
no shower. What?
Yeah, no, it's true. They did like sponge baths in the sink.
Wow.
You have to remember, it used to, I mean, Greenwich Village for years and years and years, like those were cold water flats, right? A lot of people through the 60s didn't even have hot water. Like now legally the building code, you have to have hot water,
yes.
But those were cold water tenements, and that's the way they lived. Yeah.
Amazing. Do we know, do you have any idea whatsoever what floor they lived on in 50 Commerce?
Someone
Which
wants to
apartment
visit.
exactly was theirs? I don't know. I love this question. I love how deeply people want to know.
I know. We want to know exactly where.
I know. I bet there's somebody on this Zoom who lives in that building and is like, is it mine? But I don't know. I can't tell you.
Yeah. Well, we will try to find out. I tried on a completely different topic. I've had someone really interested in where Dashiell Hammett lived, you know, in what apartment on West 9th Street, the building he lived in. So it's really hard to find out, and we may never do it. But anyway, yeah.
I see a couple more questions here. Let's see. Could you comment on the disparity of photographing changing New York during the Depression when so little new construction was going on? That's an interesting point. I can't say that there was so little new construction so much as there was so much still destruction, right? That we had that photo of the old law tenements in 1937, that we were still seeing so much of the city changing, being knocked down, or even experiencing dereliction, right? That there were shanty towns in Central Park, right? That sense of a city changing, even if new construction is not necessarily going up, because you're right. If you think about those skyscrapers, right, we saw the Woolworth building so many times, and I had mentioned to you that it's eclipsed in 1930 by the Chrysler building, and then again in 1931 by the Empire State Building. But then the Empire State Building is the tallest building in the world until we have the original Twin Towers, right, in 1971. So the Empire State Building remains the tallest building in the world for the next 40 years. You're right, that there isn't that kind of race to the sky that there had been in the 1920s. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't extraordinary flux, because there still was.
So back to an old question. Jim tells us that Google says that they lived on the 4th floor of 50 Commerce. So we can't verify that, but thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah. All right, Lucie, you've been amazing tonight, as always. Your insight, your scholarship is just so great, and we are so appreciative to have you amongst us. So thank you for tonight and for always. And if anybody else has any more questions, speak now.
Yeah, we actually have a few in the chat.
Okay.
So going back to sort of her social politics, do you know if there was any consequence of opposing McCarthyism?
Oh, sure. I mean, well, again, she was followed, and throughout her life, she actually feared being, so she gets the FBI file in 1951. And there were so many reasons that the FBI file is opened on her. One of them, I mean, it's so crazy to think about America at that time and J. Edgar Hoover at that time. But one of the reasons that the file is opened on her, not only, because she supports civil rights, not only because she's a lesbian, not only because she lives in the village, not only because she worked for the WPA, all of those things were strikes against her, but also because she, quote unquote, supported the teachers union, which was supposed to be a hotbed of communism. And that was just anti-Semitism. Like, that was just across the board anti-Semitism. There were there are a lot of Jews teaching in New York. So those people are all communists. That was one. She also held a party at Webster Hall. And so that was a knock against her. There were just all these reasons. And so she feared, the FBI file opens in 1951 and is closed on her in 1955, but she feared for the rest of her life that it would be reopened. And so when she was talking on the phone, really for the rest of her life, she would just go silent on certain subjects and wouldn't speak because she thought that her phone was being tapped. So there was certainly a psychological component, and there were people who wouldn't collaborate with her. There were certain projects where collaborators basically didn't want to be associated with the fact that she was considered to be a communist, because they themselves didn't want communist association. And so there were certain projects that she had trouble finding collaboration on. Yeah.
And sort of a follow-up question to that, do you know if there was any kind of political struggle between being a preservationist and a progressive on the other side?
Between being a preservationist and a progressive, those two things are not necessarily opposed. So I'm confused by, I guess, could I get more information?
Actually, yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. So I think maybe the question was asking, capturing history while also, I don't think it's necessarily saying it's a struggle, like a binary thing. I think it's more saying how did she use her platform as someone who captured architectural heritage and history, as well as looking at the realist, photography that she worked in.
Well, that's interesting. I think her photos of Brooklyn are very interesting in that regard, especially because she takes many photos of the Black community in Brooklyn. And she said to Lewis Hine, who was another photographer whose work she really admired, she said, those images stayed with me for the rest of my life. And those were the images that really moved her toward an understanding of civil rights, because she was told, she spoke to the people whom she photographed, who told her that they didn't like the buildings in which they were living. They didn't feel that they were appropriate dwellings, that they felt that they deserved so much more. The Black community knew its own worth in Brooklyn and said, we want better accommodation. And she saw it and she photographed it, and to her, that made a great deal of sense, right? And so that sense of like what she was seeing was the reality that she saw. And so the photographs that she makes are the reality that she sees, but they certainly then informed her politics, And so when we have a photo, even like the gunsmith on Center Street, the reality that she sees is a Marshall NYPD, right? And the gun and things like this. And so, those two things always went hand in hand. And so there is the architectural element, say, of the Black community in Brooklyn and what those buildings looked like, but then also the social realist political understanding of why do these buildings look this way? What is the ideology of this architecture?
And I think we have time for one last question, because we are rounding the half hour. So just a little personal thing for you, Lucie. What got you interested in researching Berenice and associated topics like, the figures of the village, and what draws you to this neighborhood? Yeah.
So I am really moved, and anybody who I'm so grateful if you're a repeat watcher of my village webinars, but you may know that I have a real interest in particular of the the first Bohemia in Greenwich Village before and after World War I, mostly because of those political currents, and particularly the women who really drove them. It is from my research, it is my understanding that it was the women of the village and also the Lower East Side, because it was not a binary situation, below 14th Street, who were the principal engines of the political, artistic, and social change for which the village became so well known. And so when we think of Greenwich Village as this site of ferment, that it became so famous for being, it is my understanding and contention that it was the women living south of 14th Street who, by and large, made that a reality, and Berenice Abbott is so much a part of that. And also, I know as a New Yorker, I am really moved by not only the history of the city, but the idea of the city, because those two things cannot, in my mind, be separated, right? That there is the historical narrative, but then there is the idea, and this idea of New York, which is so interesting to me. And I was realizing as I was thinking about, like, when I think about New York, this idea that I have as a New Yorker of New York, where does that idea come from? And so much of that is a visual vocabulary, right? And so when I think of that visual vocabulary, I'm like, well, where do I get that? And it occurred to me a lot of that visual vocabulary of the history of New York really does come from Berenice Abbott, and so I thought, wow, like, to what degree is my understanding of New York informed by her understanding of New York? And so I wanted to research that.
That is amazing, Lucie, and your research and your understanding of and your ability to relay this to us is extraordinary. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
It's been a really, really big pleasure for us, and we can't wait for our next adventure with you.
Yes,
you so
indeed.
Much,
I'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Very soon. Thank you so much, and good night. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.